Friedrich Müller stands frozen in an Iowa cornfield, staring at something that shouldn't exist. 3 massive steel towers rise 40 feet into the summer sky, each one gleaming like monuments to a prosperity he's never witnessed. Inside those silos sits grain from 1942, 2-year-old wheat, stored perfectly, waiting casually to be sold or fed to cattle. In Bavaria, his family's entire harvest rotted in wooden barns within months. This single moment will shatter everything he believed about the war, about Germany, about why 500,000 men had to die. June 14, 1944. 0820 hours. The Iowa countryside stretches endless and untouched by war. Obergefreiter Friedrich Müller steps off a military transport truck onto American soil for the first time. He's 28 years old, a farmer's son from Bavaria, captured 3 weeks ago during the chaos following D-Day. The ankle shackles came off at the processing center. Now he walks freely, surrounded by 46 other German prisoners of war, toward a place called Camp Algona. The camp sits in the heart of Iowa's agricultural belt, purpose-built to house enemy combatants far from any coast, any city, any target worth attacking. Friedrich notices immediately what's missing. No bomb craters, no burned buildings, no ruins. The roads are paved and intact. The fences around the camp are new, the guard towers freshly painted. Everything looks temporary, like America just built this place yesterday and might dismantle it tomorrow because they can afford to waste the lumber. Processing begins with efficiency that surprises him. Geneva Convention procedures explained in German by a board translator. Name, rank, serial number. Medical examination, delousing, uniform exchange. The Americans treat this like factory work, mechanical and thorough. No beatings, no interrogations, just paperwork and procedure. Then comes the first meal. Friedrich sits at a long table in the mess hall, staring at the tray in front of him. White bread, actual butter, coffee with real cream, potatoes, and a portion of meat he can't immediately identify. It's more food than he's seen on one plate since 1942. He eats slowly, methodically, trying not to look desperate. Around him, other prisoners do the same, eyes darting, suspicious. This must be temporary. Propaganda for Red Cross inspectors. Surely the Americans don't feed enemy prisoners like this every day. But they do. Breakfast the next morning brings the same abundance. Lunch, dinner. Friedrich lies in his bunk that first night. Clean sheets beneath him. Steam heat keeping the barracks comfortable, and tries to reconcile what he's experiencing with everything he was told. America is suffering, they said. The depression crippled them. Their economy is collapsing under war strain. Their people are starving while they waste resources on a European conflict that doesn't concern them. None of that matches what he's seen in 36 hours. Morning formation on the 3rd day brings work assignments. The camp commandant explains through translators that the United States faces an agricultural labor shortage. 30% of the farm workforce is serving in the military. German prisoners of war, under Geneva Convention provisions, will fill the gap. Friedrich and 12 others are assigned to local farms within a 15-mile radius. They'll work 6 days a week, supervised, paid nominal wages deposited for their eventual repatriation. The truck ride to the Thompson farm takes 40 minutes through landscape that feels surreal. Endless flat fields, some already green with emerging corn, others freshly planted. No soldiers, no checkpoints, no visible war. Farmhouses stand intact, painted white or red, with barns and outbuildings in good repair. Friedrich sees tractors in several fields, mechanical harvesters sitting idle, waiting for the season. His father's farm in Bavaria had 2 aging horses and hand tools. Then he sees the silos, 3 of them standing beside a large red barn like steel sentinels, each one easily 40 feet tall, maybe 12 feet in diameter, constructed from corrugated metal that reflects the morning sun. Friedrich has never seen anything like them. Grain storage in Bavaria meant wooden granaries, maybe stone buildings if you were wealthy. These look industrial, permanent, expensive. The truck stops. An American farmer approaches, 50s, work-worn hands, wearing denim overalls and a checked shirt. Harold Thompson, 3rd-generation Iowa farmer, owner of 320 acres of prime agricultural land. He greets the prisoners in English, no German, and the guard translates basic instructions. You work dawn to dusk. You get lunch and water. You follow orders. You don't run because there's nowhere to run to. Friedrich is assigned to the silo maintenance crew. Thompson walks him and two other prisoners toward the nearest silo, explaining something in English. The guard translates in fragments. Check ventilation systems, monitor temperature gauges, inspect for moisture, rotate grain levels. Friedrich understands the words but not the concept. Ventilation systems? Temperature gauges? For grain storage, they enter through a ground-level hatch. Inside, the silo rises like a cathedral of wheat. Friedrich estimates 15,000 bushels, maybe more. The grain sits in layers, and he can see built-in thermometers at different heights, metal vents in the walls, a sophisticated aeration system. Thompson points to a gauge showing internal temperature and humidity. He says something that sounds proud. The guard translates, "This wheat is from 1942, still perfect. Another year or two before we sell it or use it for feed." Friedrich stops moving. 1942? 2 years ago. This grain has been sitting here, perfectly preserved, while in Germany people scrape by on ration cards allowing 250 grams of bread per day. His mind does the mathematics automatically. This one silo holds more grain than his entire village in Bavaria produced in a good year. And Thompson has 3 of them. And this is just one farm. The guard said there are hundreds of farms in this county alone. Something breaks inside Friedrich's understanding of reality. Not dramatically. Just a small crack, like ice beginning to thaw. Lunch arrives at noon. The prisoners sit in the barn's shade while Thompson's wife brings sandwiches, milk, apples. Friedrich examines his sandwich. Thick slices of bread with butter and cheese and ham. In Germany, this meal would feed his family for a day, maybe 2 if they stretched it. Here, it's lunch for a prisoner of war. Otto, one of the other German POWs from Saxony, whispers in German, "They're fattening us up for something. This can't be standard." But it is standard. Every day brings the same abundance. And as the first week progresses, Friedrich begins to understand the silos are just the beginning. The real revelation is the system behind them. Thompson explains, through the guard's translations, and increasingly through gestures and simple words, how American grain storage works. The silos are hermetically sealed, airtight. The steel construction prevents moisture intrusion. Built-in ventilation systems allow controlled air circulation. Fumigation protocols prevent insect infestation. Temperature monitoring prevents spontaneous combustion from grain respiration. It's a sophisticated technological system, developed and refined over decades, that allows multi-year storage with spoilage rates below 2%. Friedrich thinks of his father's wooden granary back home. Open to air, moisture seeping through gaps, rats and insects eating freely, mold spreading in damp seasons. They considered themselves lucky to preserve 60% of stored grain through a single winter. Thompson casually mentions spoilage rates under 2% like it's normal, expected, not worth celebrating. The second week brings harvest preparation. Thompson needs the silos emptied to make room for the summer wheat harvest coming in July. He assigns Friedrich and the crew to grain removal, transferring the 1942 wheat to trucks for transport to a dealer. Friedrich works inside the silo, shoveling grain into a mechanical auger system that elevates it into waiting vehicles. The wheat looks perfect, golden, clean. No discoloration, no mold smell. Just dry, preserved grain that could be milled today and produce quality flour. A truck spills about 200 pounds during loading. Grain cascades onto the ground, golden kernels spreading in the dirt. Thompson sees it, shrugs, tells the driver to keep moving. Not worth stopping the machinery. Friedrich stares at the spilled grain. 200 pounds. Enough to feed his family for 3 months. Thompson considers it not worth the 5 minutes it would take to sweep up. That evening, Friedrich lies in his bunk at the camp trying to write a letter home. Camp regulations allow prisoners to write 1 letter per week, censored but permitted. He wants to tell his mother what he's seen. The silos, the abundance, the casual waste. But he can't find words that won't sound like lies or propaganda or delusion. How do you explain to someone starving on ration cards that your captors casually discard more food than she's seen in months? How do you describe wealth so complete it becomes invisible to the people possessing it? He writes instead about his health, the weather, the crops growing in Iowa. Safe subjects, real but meaningless. July brings the wheat harvest. Friedrich witnesses American industrial agriculture at full capacity. Thompson operates 2 combine harvesters, massive mechanical systems that cut, thresh, and collect grain in a single pass. Each machine does the work of 40 men with hand tools. Thompson's crew, including the German POWs, harvests 320 acres in 3 weeks. Friedrich calculates that the same harvest in Bavaria, using traditional methods, would require 200 workers and 2 months of brutal labor. The combine harvesters dump wheat directly into trucks that transport it to the silos. Mechanical augers elevate the grain into the towers. The entire process is mechanized, efficient, fast. Friedrich watches tonnage accumulate. Thompson estimates 12,000 bushels from this harvest, average for the farm, nothing special. He'll store it for a year or 2, sell when prices improve, use some for seed and animal feed. 12,000 bushels. Friedrich does the mathematics. At 60 pounds per bushel, that's 720,000 pounds of wheat, 360 tons, from one farm, in one season. His father's farm produced maybe 10 tons in a good year. The scale becomes incomprehensible. Iowa has tens of thousands of farms. The United States has millions of acres under cultivation. And this is just wheat. The corn harvest won't even begin until September. Friedrich begins to understand that America doesn't just have abundance. America has systematic, industrial, overwhelming abundance built into its agricultural foundation. Otto asks Thompson one evening, in broken English, about government food control. Does the state tell you what to plant, how much to grow, where to sell? Thompson laughs, genuinely amused by the question. The government offers crop subsidies, voluntary programs that pay farmers to participate in price support systems. But nobody forces anything. Thompson decides what to plant based on market prices, weather conditions, soil quality. He sells to whoever offers the best price. The land is his, bought and paid for, mortgage cleared in 1941 when war demand drove grain prices up. Friedrich struggles to process this. His father's farm operated under Nazi agricultural control. The Reichsnährstand, the state food organization, dictated crop quotas, controlled prices, confiscated surpluses, punished hoarding. German farmers were cogs in a centralized system designed to maximize state control. American farmers are independent businessmen with autonomy and property rights. August brings a revelation that completes Friedrich's education. He's working inside silo number 2, inspecting the grain level, when Thompson climbs up to check on progress. They're alone, and Thompson seems contemplative. He asks Friedrich, in simple English supplemented with gestures, about farming in Germany. Friedrich explains as best he can. Small plots, horse-drawn equipment, government quotas, limited storage, high spoilage. Thompson nods slowly, processing. Then he says something that Friedrich will remember for the rest of his life. The exact words are in English, and Friedrich's understanding is imperfect, but the meaning comes through clearly. Your government feared farmers with power. Storage means independence. Farmer with full silos can wait out bad prices, bad policies, bad weather. That's freedom. That's why free societies let farmers store. Control food, control people. Friedrich sits down on the grain pile, overwhelmed. Thompson isn't being cruel or triumphant. He's just explaining an obvious truth that Friedrich never considered. The silos aren't just storage. They're economic power, political independence, the ability to wait, to choose, to resist. Everything the Nazi state couldn't allow because control requires dependence. September brings news that Germany's military situation has deteriorated catastrophically. The Allies are crossing into German territory. Cities are being bombed around the clock. Civilian casualties are mounting. Friedrich receives a letter from his mother, the first in months. She writes carefully, knowing censors will read every word. Food situation difficult. Father's health declining. Village mostly intact but worried about Russian advance from east. She doesn't say they're starving, but Friedrich reads between the lines. He's sitting in an American prison camp, eating 3 meals a day, gaining weight, working on a farm with more stored food than his entire region produced in a year. His mother is scraping by on ration cards in a collapsing nation. The guilt is crushing, but beneath the guilt, something else grows. A question. Why? Why is there such disparity? Why did Germany enter a war for living space and resources when the enemy possessed abundance beyond comprehension? Why did Nazi ideology promise prosperity while creating scarcity? Why did the system he fought for deliberately prevent the very infrastructure that could have fed his people? October 1944. Friedrich approaches the camp educational officer, a U.S. Army lieutenant responsible for prisoner education programs. He asks in halting English whether the food abundance is temporary. Propaganda. Special treatment for Red Cross inspections. The officer, bemused, brings out agricultural statistics yearbooks. Published data from 1935 through 1943. Friedrich can read numbers even if the English text is difficult. The numbers don't lie. American agricultural surplus is consistent, structural, decades in development. Even during the Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history, the United States exported grain to Europe. The problem wasn't production. The problem was distribution, poverty, economic collapse. But the farms kept producing. The silos kept filling. The infrastructure kept functioning. Friedrich stays up late that night studying the yearbooks. U.S. wheat production in 1944, 1.1 billion bushels. German wheat production the same year, under Allied bombing and resource depletion, approximately 150 million bushels. The United States, with roughly double Germany's population, produces 7 times more wheat. And wheat is just one crop. Corn production dwarfs wheat. America feeds itself, supplies its military, sends food to Britain and the Soviet Union, and still maintains strategic reserves. Germany conquered half of Europe searching for resources and still couldn't feed its people. America sat isolated between 2 oceans and created abundance. November brings the first snow and a deepening sense of displacement. Friedrich has been in Iowa for 5 months. He knows the Thompson farm better than his own family's land back in Bavaria. He operates the silo ventilation systems competently. He can estimate grain volume by sight. He understands moisture content requirements. He's learned more about modern agriculture in 5 months than his father learned in a lifetime. Christmas 1944 arrives with cruel irony. The camp provides a special meal for prisoners, supplemented by Red Cross packages. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pie, coffee with cream. Friedrich eats mechanically, thinking about the Battle of the Bulge raging in Belgium. German soldiers, starving and desperate, launched a massive offensive partly because they knew American supply lines would be stretched. Capture American supply depots. Feed the army on enemy stocks. It's a strategy born of desperation. Friedrich remembers stories from older soldiers. The Wehrmacht in Russia, 1941, counting on capturing Soviet grain stores to feed the invasion force, living off the land, confiscating local food. It didn't work then. It won't work now. You can't sustain modern mechanized warfare on looted supplies. You need infrastructure, industrial production, the systematic abundance that builds silos and fills them for years in advance. American soldiers in Europe, Friedrich has heard, sometimes discard rations they consider boring or heavy. MREs thrown away because a soldier doesn't like the menu that day. The waste that would have kept a German company fed for a week. It's not cruelty. It's abundance so complete, it becomes invisible. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The news reaches Camp Algona the same day. Friedrich stands in formation with hundreds of other prisoners as the camp commandant announces the war's end. Some prisoners cry. Some stand stoic. Friedrich feels numb. The war he fought is over. The Germany he knew is destroyed. And he's standing in Iowa, thousands of miles away, having spent the war's final year learning that everything he believed was built on lies. Thompson approaches Friedrich a few days later while they're working on routine silo maintenance. The farmer looks uncomfortable, searching for words. Finally, in his simple English, he asks what Friedrich will do when repatriation begins. Friedrich doesn't know. Return to Bavaria, probably. Help rebuild his family's farm. Try to survive in whatever Germany emerges from the ruins. Thompson nods slowly. Then he says something unexpected. When things stabilize, when Germany recovers, Thompson can sponsor Friedrich's immigration. America will need agricultural workers. Friedrich knows modern silo systems now. That knowledge has value. Think about it. Friedrich thanks him, surprised by the offer, uncertain what it means. That evening, he climbs the ladder on silo number 3, alone, and sits on the catwalk encircling the top. The Iowa countryside stretches in every direction, flat and prosperous and untouched by war. Other farms dot the landscape, each with their own silos, their own abundance, their own casual wealth. He thinks about Bavaria, bombed cities, destroyed infrastructure, millions dead, food shortages that will take years to resolve. His father's aging farm with its wooden granary and pre-industrial methods. The gap between what he's seen here and what waits at home is measured in decades of development. March 1946. Friedrich boards a transport ship in New York Harbor, bound for Europe. The repatriation process has taken months, complicated by the sheer logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners, while Europe sorts through its devastation. He carries a duffel bag with his few possessions and a mind full of memories that nobody back home will believe. The ship docks in Hamburg. The city is rubble. Friedrich has seen photographs, read reports, but the reality is overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods reduced to broken concrete and twisted metal, people living in basements and makeshift shelters. The infrastructure that makes modern life possible simply gone, destroyed by years of Allied bombing. The train journey south to Bavaria takes 2 days because the rail system is barely functional. Friedrich sees the devastation continue mile after mile. Destroyed bridges, bombed out factories, fields gone to weeds because there's no fuel for tractors, no fertilizer, no seed stock. This is what defeat looks like at the industrial scale. His village is partially intact by comparison. Some buildings damaged, some destroyed, most people alive but struggling. Friedrich finds his mother thinner than he remembers, aged beyond her years by stress and malnutrition. His father died 6 months ago. Heart failure, officially. Starvation and despair, really. Friedrich tries to explain where he's been, what he's seen. His mother listens with the blank expression of someone too exhausted to process new information. The other villagers are skeptical or dismissive. American abundance is propaganda, they say. Exaggeration. Psychological warfare to demoralize the defeated. Nobody has silos that store grain for years. Nobody wastes food like you describe. You've been brainwashed by the victors. Friedrich stops trying to convince them. He focuses instead on rebuilding his father's farm with the knowledge he gained. He improvises moisture control in the old wooden granary, rotating grain stocks, improving ventilation. Small improvements with available materials. It helps, marginally. But he can't build steel silos. He can't afford mechanical harvesters. He can't electrify the farm or install telephone lines. The infrastructure gap is too vast for individual effort to bridge. 1948 brings the Marshall Plan. American aid floods into Western Europe, including agricultural assistance. Friedrich is one of the first in his village to understand what's happening. This is the abundance he witnessed, being shared because America can afford to share it. The surplus that filled silos in Iowa now arrives as aid to prevent German starvation. He becomes an informal coordinator, helping his village navigate aid distribution, explaining modern agricultural techniques he learned in Iowa. Some people listen. Some still dismiss him. But gradually evidence accumulates. The Americans really do have that level of abundance. The stories weren't exaggeration. The gap is real. The 1950s bring slow modernization to West Germany. Marshall Plan aid helps rebuild infrastructure. Steel silos begin appearing on German farms, manufactured using American designs. Mechanical harvesters spread. Rural electrification expands. German agriculture begins approaching American productivity levels, but it's a process measured in decades. Friedrich becomes an agricultural advisor, teaching techniques learned during his prisoner of war experience. By 1960, German wheat yields match American yields per acre, but labor productivity remains far behind. American farms still operate with a fraction of the workforce, sustained by superior mechanization and infrastructure investment that started generations earlier. Friedrich marries, has children, watches West Germany transform from ruins to prosperity. The economic miracle, they call it. But Friedrich knows it's not a miracle. It's systematic investment in infrastructure, technology, education, the same process that built American abundance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, compressed into 2 decades of intensive reconstruction. 1973. A historian researching prisoner of war experiences interviews Friedrich. What most shocked you about America? The historian asks. Friedrich, now 57 years old, doesn't hesitate. The silos, those massive steel towers full of grain, not because they existed, but because Americans considered them unremarkable, normal. Expected. For Americans, multi-year food storage was standard practice. For Germans, it was unimaginable luxury. The historian asks Friedrich to elaborate. He thinks carefully before responding. The gap between American normal and German impossible explained everything about the war's outcome. Germany fought with ideology and willpower, believing spirit could overcome material disadvantage. America fought with abundance and systems built over generations. You can't will grain silos into existence. You can't conjure industrial infrastructure through ideological purity. You build them decade by decade, investment by investment, prioritizing boring things like rural electrification and agricultural research over military glory. The silos were monuments to choices made long before the war started. America chose the Homestead Act in 1862, distributing land to create a yeoman farmer class. Germany chose junker estates and peasant dependence. America chose land-grant universities in 1862, democratizing agricultural education. Germany kept agricultural knowledge concentrated among elites. America chose the Rural Electrification Act in 1936, modernizing the countryside. Germany prioritized military industrialization over rural development. By the time the war started, the outcome was already determined by infrastructure choices made 50 to 80 years earlier. The fighting was just the violent process of making that predetermined outcome reality. The historian asks if Friedrich ever regretted not accepting Thompson's immigration offer. Friedrich considers the question. He chose to return because his mother needed him, because rebuilding Germany felt like duty, because he couldn't abandon his homeland in its worst moment. He doesn't regret that choice, but sometimes he wonders what his life would have been like farming in Iowa, operating those magnificent silos, participating in that systematic abundance. 1985. Friedrich is 69, retired, living in a prosperous Bavaria that would have seemed like fantasy to his 1946 self. He visits his grandson's farm, a modern operation with steel silos, mechanical harvesters, computer-monitored grain storage. His grandson studied agricultural science at university. The farm is profitable, efficient, integrated into European markets. Friedrich looks at the silos. German manufactured but built to American specifications. Took us 40 years to build what they had in 1944, he tells his grandson. But at least we finally learned the lesson. His grandson, born in 1962, doesn't fully understand. The war is ancient history to him. The hunger years are stories grandparents tell. The current abundance feels natural, permanent, unremarkable. That's the final irony, Friedrich thinks. Abundance, once achieved, becomes invisible. His grandson looks at the farm's silos the same way Thompson looked at his in Iowa, back in 1944, as normal infrastructure, expected, not worth celebrating. The miracle becomes mundane through familiarity. Friedrich returns home that evening, pulls out a box of old letters and documents he's kept for decades. Among them is a faded photograph from Camp Algona, prisoners posing in front of a barracks. He studies the faces, young men far from home, most of them dead now or scattered across continents. He remembers their conversations, their disbelief, their gradual understanding that everything they'd been told was lies. He also finds a letter he wrote but never sent, dated December 1944. The censors would have rejected it anyway. He reads his own words from 40 years ago, written in the shock of realization. We fought believing we defended Germany from scarcity. But scarcity was always our reality, created by our own system. The Americans had abundance because they built systems that generated abundance. We had scarcity because we built systems that generated control. You can't eat control. You can't feed a nation on ideology. But you can feed millions from properly designed silos storing grain for years. The letter ends with a question he asked himself repeatedly during those months in Iowa. Why did we fight? The answer he's reached over decades is simple and terrible. Germany fought because its leadership chose expansion over infrastructure, conquest over development, ideology over pragmatism. The war wasn't about defending the homeland. It was about refusing to learn the lesson that Iowa taught him in the summer of 1944. Friedrich puts the letter away. His granddaughter is visiting tomorrow, bringing her children. They'll eat lunch together in a warm house with electric heating, refrigerated food, tap water, all the invisible infrastructure of prosperity. The great-grandchildren will probably waste food, leave vegetables on their plates, not finish their bread. It will bother Friedrich for a moment, old reflexes from years of scarcity. But then he'll remember the spilled grain at Thompson's farm, 200 pounds left in the dirt because it wasn't worth stopping the machinery. Waste is a privilege of abundance. Efficiency is a luxury of surplus. The Germans of his generation knew neither. They fought a war they couldn't win, for reasons that made no sense, against an enemy whose true strength was never military force but systematic prosperity built over generations. The silos taught him that lesson. 3 steel towers in an Iowa cornfield filled with grain from previous years, operated by a farmer who considered multi-year food storage normal and unremarkable. That normalcy was the real weapon. Not tanks, not planes, not soldiers. Just the casual, systematic, overwhelming abundance of a society that invested in boring infrastructure instead of glorious conquest. Friedrich is old now. The memories fade at the edges, details blur, but the silos remain crystal clear in his mind. 40 feet tall, steel construction, hermetic sealing, ventilation systems, temperature gauges. 2-year-old grain, perfectly preserved, waiting to be sold when prices improved or fed to cattle if it got too old. In Bavaria, that grain would have been treasure. In Iowa, it was routine. That gap between treasure and routine explained everything. The war, the defeat, the decades of rebuilding, the hard lessons learned through suffering that could have been avoided if German leadership had chosen silos over swagger, infrastructure over ideology, boring prosperity over glorious conquest. He learned it working as a prisoner on an enemy farm, surrounded by abundance he couldn't comprehend, operated by a man who offered him immigration after the war ended. Thompson saw him as a farmhand who learned quickly. Friedrich saw Thompson as a prophet of a system he never knew existed. The silos stand in his memory, eternal and immovable, monuments to choices, testaments to systems, evidence of roads not taken. They were just grain storage, practical and utilitarian. But they taught Friedrich Müller more about power, prosperity, and the price of ideology than any political speech or military victory ever could. 3 steel towers in Iowa, 40 feet tall, full of wheat from 1942. Impossible, unbelievable, and absolutely real. That's what Friedrich tells anyone who asks about his war experience. Not battles, not capture, not camp life, just silos. Because the silos explained everything else. Friedrich's story reminds us that the most powerful lessons often come from the smallest details. A grain silo taught him more about power and prosperity than any battlefield ever could. History is full of these overlooked moments that changed everything. If stories like this one make you see the past differently, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the forgotten details that explain why our world works the way it does. Real history, real people, real lessons that still matter today. Drop a like if Friedrich's realization hit you the same way it hit him standing in that Iowa cornfield. And leave a comment telling us, what small detail from history completely changed how you understand the world? Was it a photograph? A statistic? A story someone told you? We read every comment, and your insights often become our next deep dive. This is history that matters. Not just dates and battles, but the infrastructure, the systems, the boring choices that determined who won and who lost before the first shot was ever fired. Subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story, because the truth is always more interesting than the myth. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.